Well, I want to share with you an example, one of the most beautiful, one of the clearest examples of how our ancestors were able to document the times of extremes, and perhaps more importantly, how they were able to share with us what it would mean for future generations, what to look for, the actual markings in time and history, so that we would know where we are in the cycles and what it would take for us in our thinking and the way we live to get through these cycles. I'm talking about the Hopi map of time. The ancient Hopi on the mesas of northern Arizona in the United States have one of the most continuous records of their lineage and of their history from their creation story forward. And the Hopi have in their homeland a very mysterious rock. It's called Prophecy Rock on the third mesa. And this rock, they tell us, even they do not know for certain who created the hieroglyphs that were on this rock. They don't know the exact person that did it, but they have a pretty good idea of when it happened, and they have a really good idea of what this rock is saying to them. So what I'd like to do is share this with you and some very rare images that we don't get to see very often. What you're seeing on your screen right now is the major portion of Prophecy Rock, and I recognize that the lines are a little faint. We had the opportunity of one of the elders to take a piece of chalk and trace through the lines that you're seeing so that the cameras could photograph these a little bit better. And I'm going to do this with a computer. I'm going to use a computer to trace across the lines so that you can see on your screen precisely the timelines that we're talking about. So what the Hopi say is at the end of the last great cycle of change, what's called a great world age, a 5,000-year cycle that is 1/5 of the greater 26,000-year cycle that's called the precession of the equinoxes. So at the end of that last 5,000-year cycle, those who had come before them, their ancestors, created this map. And it was a map that told them two things. It told them when the cycle ended. It told them what they could expect to happen, big things, landmarks, milestones of time as they would go through, and it would tell them how to think and live both on the inner world as well as the outer world, so they would successfully thrive as they go through the next change. And they tell us that change is the change that we are experiencing right now. So this Hopi map of time has been preserved for a very long time, and they said they preserved it for us, for you and me, so that we can benefit from their wisdom and do it today when we need it the most. So what is this map of time telling us? I'm going to begin on the left-hand side of the screen, and what you see is that I've traced out two paths. And what the Hopi say is at the end of the last cycle, the people of this world were given the opportunity to walk two paths that would carry them to the end of their time into the next cycle where we are right now. What makes it so interesting is that in the beginning, both paths look very similar. And you can see that when you look on the rock. They both look very similar, just in different places. But if you look closely, however, you'll see that the people that are depicted on each path are telling a very different story. If you look at the upper path, for example, there are people there, people living on the upper path. Their heads are not connected to their bodies. And what the Hopi elders say is that these are the people who live in this time, the people that walk that path that do not know themselves. Their heads are not connected to their bodies because they don't know who they are. They've lost themselves. And if you look closely at this path, you see that while it begins in a very similar fashion to the one below, as the path progresses, it begins to change. And look at what happens. It begins to get a little jagged, a little rough, begins to get steep and an incline. And if you look closely, the path ends abruptly. It goes nowhere. The path just stops. But if you look at the lower path, it again looks very similar to the one above it. It looks smooth and relatively even. The difference is it continues that way throughout the entire hieroglyph. And along the lower path, there are people depicted as well. there is an elderly person, and we know this person is elderly because the person is leaning over, hunched, leaning on a cane, which is a sign of advanced age. We also know that food is plentiful on the lower path because right behind the person is a stalk of corn that is growing, and that is a sign that food is abundant on this path. You don't see any evidence of that on the path above. So right off, we're seeing a distinction between these two paths. Now, there is a third path as well that may not be as evident. I'm going to trace it out for you on your screen. It's the green vertical line that connects the two existing paths. That line, the Hopi say, marks a point in time that they call the point of no return. And for them, that point of no return was the year 1998. And in 1998, the Hopi sent the eldest elder of the Hopi nation to the United Nations to deliver the message that this map has left for the people of the earth. And what he said is in 1998 that we are now living this moment in the map of time, the point of no return, that while in the past it's always been possible to choose between the upper and the lower path. And truthfully, we can always choose. From 1998 on, it becomes much more difficult to choose. So that was the time, that was the warning, that was the message that was delivered to the United Nations by the Hopi Nation in 1998. And to help them know where they were on this map, I'm going to invite you to look at the image one more time. And on the lower path, what you see are three circles that straddle this lower path. The first one on the left is what the Hopi call the first great shaking of the earth. They said between the time of the last 5,000-year cycle beginning and when it ends, the people of the earth will go through these three great shakings. And the first shaking, they say, is the First World War. It's already happened. The second shaking, you see right next to that, you probably can guess, is the Second World War. Then we see the vertical line, the point of no return, and to the right of 1998, we see the third great shaking. And when I asked the elders, I said, does that mean that we have another war? What does that shaking mean? And they said, we don't know. Our ancestors could never tell us. It doesn't mean that there necessarily is a war between nations. It can be a conflict in beliefs. It can be a conflict of ideas and ideology. It could be a conflict of religion. It could be a war. But they said the truth is we don't know. It's something to watch out for in this time after 1998, before the end of the close of this next cycle. So what does this mean for us? This is part of the mystery of cycles. When we begin to open to the possibilities of what is called fractal time, the fact that time and history repeats itself again and again, this is the wisdom that our ancestors tap into in their time and still do today. It is largely discounted by modern science. I want to take this to the next step. This is the map. It's telling us what we can expect. It's telling us where we are now. It wouldn't do us any good if we didn't know what to do about it. So now I'm going to share with you another image of the same rock, and you can see it now. And on this image, it's a little bit different perspective. You can see where the upper path ends abruptly and goes nowhere. But you can also see, and this is where the elder has traced out the images with the chalk, the lower image, it reaches a corner, which is the edge of the rock, but it doesn't stop. It continues. It goes around that edge and it keeps going. They tell us that that edge is our time of extremes. That edge is where we are right now. And that the path that will carry us gracefully and allow us to thrive with food and to advanced age across that path is the lower path. So when I had the opportunity to meet with one of the Hopi elders, one of the eldest elders who has passed and is no longer with us, and I'm not sharing his name, and I don't mean to be mysterious, but in honor of their tradition, they asked that we not say the name of someone who has passed because it keeps calling the spirit back to us. So I'm simply going to say a recent elder who shared this wisdom with us today. And what he said is this: the qualities of both of these paths, the upper path, he said the people that walk the upper path, They live in the world of comfort, greed, and profit. And I looked at that and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Profit especially. I said, does that mean that we shouldn't make money? Does that mean profit is a bad thing? He said, no. It's not that kind of profit. It's not about money. He said, this is the kind of profit where one person or a group of people benefit at the expense and the suffering of another. Whenever we do better at the expense of someone else hurting or doing worse, that's the kind of profit that is on the path that leads nowhere. It's the path that ends abruptly. It's a path that cannot possibly carry us through our time of extremes because it is not a sustainable path. And I said, well, what is this lower path all about? What are the qualities of the lower path? The lower path, and probably is no surprise to you, is based upon a different kind of quality: love, strength, and balance. Love, strength, and balance. And if you look closely at each of these qualities, what you'll find is that comfort, greed, profit, those are things that we do in the world. Love, strength, and balance, those are things that we become in our lives. And this is the essence of many of the indigenous traditions, including the Hopi, many of the ancient traditions, and now what you know from quantum physics, from the hologram, from entanglement, from the photon experiments, all the things that we have talked about. It all boils down to this simple principle. We must become in our lives the things that we choose to experience in our world. We want a world of love, strength, and balance. We must become those things in our lives and live them every moment to the best of our ability, day in and day out. Not be out on the street angrily protesting that we want love, strength, and balance. It's counterproductive. It makes no sense. Now you begin to understand why. So I wanted to share this with you. This is the Hopi perspective. Well, this Hopi wisdom, it should come as no surprise. Intuitively, when we look at this, we say, well, of course, that makes total sense. Intuitively, it makes sense. This all goes back to the ideas of Charles Darwin. So once again, we're hearkening back to these ideas in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Charles Darwin's ideas of what it takes to get through the difficult times are in direct competition with what the Hopi have just told us. They're in a direct opposition, and they're about competition. Just to refresh your memory, what I'd like to do, I'm going to read Darwin's words to you once again. Now, I mentioned this a couple of segments earlier. And what I said is that Darwin went into the natural world and he observed in nature very specific forms of life, ants, birds, and the way that they behaved. And what Darwin said, his insight, he said, what I'm seeing here in this place on the earth in this moment in time must be a representative, a little piece of a bigger law that applies to all life everywhere all the time. And as I mentioned earlier, I think this is where we went wrong. This is a dangerous, dangerous way to think. Let me read you Darwin's precise words so you can see his thinking and why this is so dangerous. In his book, Origin of Species, what Darwin said, he believed that life was a struggle. And while he believed it on the one hand, he also prefaces his own words by telling us what he's about to say to us doesn't make a lot of sense. So I want you to see what he's saying and just hear his own words. Darwin said, quote, "It may not be a logical deduction, but it is far more satisfactory to look at instincts such as ants making slaves of other ants as small examples of one general law leading to the advancement of all beings. And that law is the law that says we should multiply, we should vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. Let the strongest live and the weakest die." This is such a dangerous way to think. And it's dangerous for a couple of reasons, particularly because of when it was introduced. Late 1800s, early 1900s. This is when the great wars were being fought. This is when the thinking that was being created of how people relate to other people. Darwin is telling us that when he saw the ants capture another colony of ants, they didn't kill them, they enslaved them and made them work. He said that is a reflection of a general law. Let the strongest live and the weakest die. This later became survival of the fittest. Darwin called it survival of the strongest, and he said this in his own words, and I want you to know that. So I'm not mincing words. Survival of the strongest. The ideas of the great genocides and the great suffering of the late 1800s, the 1900s, throughout the 20th century are directly linked to this thinking. If you look at the manifestos, you look at the writings, and you look at the links of the greatest acts of war, aggression, and genocide, the philosophies are directly based and sometimes quoted. I'm not saying Darwin intended this, but this is how a dangerous thinking like this can be misinterpreted and applied in horrible ways that create tremendous suffering in our world. And it's based on something that's not true. This is a false assumption of science, and that's the good news. That's the good news that I want to share with you right now. The best science of the modern world is now telling us one of the deepest truths, I believe, that has the greatest impact, the greatest consequence on our world as a whole, on your life and my life individually. If you think back to the inverted pyramid that began this entire series, it was in episode number 2, when we talked about the false assumptions of science. Assumption number 6, at the top of the pyramid, was that the fundamental law of nature is based upon competition, conflict, and struggle. And that comes directly from Darwin's ideas that were embraced and not questioned in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It is deeply ingrained as the fabric of our very society. The economic system that's collapsing right now, the way that we're dealing with differences between nations unsuccessfully, the way that we are trying to share resources, food, water, oil, energy, communications, defense. All of these things are based in this idea of survival of the strongest. In our time of extremes, as our ideas and what we think about ourselves and our beliefs are being pushed to the limits because the extremes are changing the environment where they've been applied. The ideas have been applied in the past. All those ideas are breaking down. They're not working. They can't work because they're not true. They're based in false assumptions. And this idea of cooperation versus competition, this is key. So I want to share this with you. I'm going to take a minute to do this. I think it's important. The best science of the modern world is now telling us that, in fact, the fundamental rule of nature is cooperation and what biologists call mutual aid, not competition and conflict and survival. Now, we all know that competition, conflict, and survival, they're a fact. They happen. We see them all the time. They're not the fundamental rule. And to the degree that we see violence, competition, and conflict, to the degree that we see that happening, what we're actually witnessing is how far we or any population has strayed from the harmony of the deepest truth of nature. It tells us the more violence and conflict we see, it tells us how far we've strayed from the natural laws of this world. And if we believe that we somehow are separate from nature, that we don't have to abide by the fundamental laws of nature that all the forms of life abide by, that is the opening to our demise. We've seen this happen in the past with other civilizations and other cultures. There's a powerful lesson that we can learn from this. And our own science, the best science of the modern world, gives us the reason to change our thinking. We don't have to do it on faith. We don't have to do it on trust because we've asked science to tell us the deep truths of our lives. Now science is revealing those truths. The question is, will we embrace those truths? Well, here is the truth of what Darwin said about cooperation. There was a study that was done. Over 400 papers were written asking the question about competition and conflict. Specifically, the question was this: what is the optimum amount of competition in any situation, in any place? And when I say competition, I just want to be very clear what I'm saying. I'm not talking about a friendly game of soccer or chess or checkers at the family dinner table. When we say competition, this is what biologists call violent competition, okay? What is the optimum amount of violent competition in the world? Over 400 studies came up with the same answer. And once again, for clarity, I want to read to you directly the results of that study. In his book entitled No Contest, The Case Against Competition, Alfie Kahn wrote, quote, "The ideal amount of violent competition in any environment, in the classroom, in the workplace, in the family, in the playing field, is none." He said, "Violent competition always, always, always is destructive." So this is one of the first cases late in the 20th century. This was in the 1990s when these studies were published, and they opened the door to a possibility. Scientists began saying, what if we're wrong? What if the ideas that we've embraced about competition and conflict, that are reflected in our economy, that are reflected in our defense policy, reflected in the way we deal with other nations, what if they're wrong? And that led to even more studies. Alfie Kahn was one of the first. But from there, scientists began writing about this competition, and what they found in the year 2008 made headlines in one of the most prestigious scientific journals. It's called New Scientist. There was an entire issue based upon evolution. Once again, not my words, I want you to hear exactly the words, the conclusions of what this article was saying to us. In an article by Michael LePage, it was entitled Evolution Myths, Survival of the Fittest Justifies Everyone for Themselves, the New Scientist edition, April 2008. What Michael LePage said is this. He said, quote, "What we see in the wild is not every animal out for itself." He said cooperation is an incredibly successful survival strategy, and he went on to clarify that. He said when cooperation breaks down, the results can be disastrous, end of quote. So what Michael LePage is saying in New Scientist, and what the scientific thinking is now that is willing to embrace the facts of what we're seeing along these lines, is that it's not every animal out for themselves. There is violent competition, but that competition is part of a higher order that we see in the animal kingdom that is actually a form of cooperation. When we see the weakest of one form of life succumb to other forms of life, that is a cooperative endeavor. It is not animal against animal fighting for the survival of their lives. The same principle now that we're seeing in science. This is science. It's telling us that what we've been thinking about our deepest truth is not necessarily the deepest truth. The biology now is reflected in the archaeology of our past. This is fascinating to me. Let me say it again. The biology of this discovery is reflected in the archaeology of our past. Here's what I mean by that. The biology is telling us that we live in this world of cooperation and mutual aid where conflict may occur sometimes. Now I'm going to go back to some of the archaeological sites that we talked about earlier in this episode, and I'm going to reveal something now that I didn't talk about then so that we could do it right now. There is a mystery that scientists have found when they are uncovering some of those ancient sites, the ancient civilizations that are older than 5,000 years. So remember, 5,000 years is when we're taught civilization began. I shared with you earlier in this program the evidence that tells us there's another cycle before that. So I'm going to share with you some of the hallmarks of this previous 5,000-year cycle. Whether we are talking about Göbekli Tepe, or whether we're talking about the Gulf of Khambhat off the coast of India under 120 feet of water, or whether we're talking about Chateau Hoyuk, that I didn't identify specifically, but I mentioned it in Turkey, along with Göbekli Tepe, or whether we're talking about Corral, the oldest technologically advanced civilization in all of the Americas that's now located in northern Peru. There's a common theme through all of these, and the theme is amazing. Every one of these sites, there is no evidence of any weapons that has been discovered in any of these ancient sites or others within this 5,000-year window. There is no evidence of mass war, no evidence of mass graves, no walls to protect the homes, no walls to protect the communities, no evidence of mutilated bodies that you would expect to see from armies facing off against other armies and the result of ancient warfare. It simply does not exist in this block of archaeological discoveries, this 5,000-year block before our cycle began. Why is that? If we are to believe what the texts themselves tell us, they say that before we began our cycle of war, darkness, and violence 5,000 years ago, that now has brought us to the point of extremes where we are now, the cycle before was a very different cycle. It was a golden age of peace and cooperation, and that the cycles alternate one after another, war, and peace, triggered by the climate change and the competition for resources when that is needed. What does that mean for us? We've just crossed that 5,000-year mark, all right? We are now into the next cycle. The question is, will we perpetuate the cycle of war and violence from our last 5,000 years, or will we choose a golden age of peace and cooperation based in the deepest truths of nature and the harmony that we know is possible?
So, as a Vedic archaeologist, I would expect to find evidence for a human presence going back about 2 billion years on Earth. And the Vedic writings speak of such things. You know, for example, there's the Bhagavat Purana. The Puranas are the historical writings of ancient India. The Bhagavat Purana says that at the beginning of the day of Brahma, there were human beings living on Earth, and it even gives examples of them. One of them was, his name was Dhruva. He was a very saintly king. So,
and this would date to 2 billion years ago.
Yes.
Yes.
But actually, we have to look at the day of Brahma. It is divided into subcycles called manvantars. A day of Brahma is divided into 14 manvantar periods. And after each of them, there's a devastation after which the earth has to be repopulated. Each manvantar lasts roughly 300 million years, I think about 306 million years to be exact. And after each one, there's a devastation. Now, we're currently in the 7th manvantar of the current kalpa or day of Brahma. That means there have been 6 before us. And that means there have been 6 devastations after which the earth had to be repopulated. Now, this personality, Dhruva, that I was mentioning, according to the Bhagavat Purana, he existed during the first manvantar. And, you know, there's a sacred city in India called Mathura. And in Mathura, there are temples and sacred places that are dedicated to the memory of this person who existed during the first manvantar of the kalpa about 2 billion years ago. Even before that, you know, there was a night of Brahma. Before that, there was another day of Brahma. Human beings were existing. And then before that, there was another day of Brahma, another. So the human body, which is actually a vehicle for the soul, for the conscious self, has always been available for conscious selves who come to this level of reality, material reality. The original home of the conscious self, the world of Brahman or spirit or pure consciousness, is beyond time. There are no cycles of creation and destruction. That is our original home to which we are meant to return. But for those conscious selves in the world of matter, different vehicles are available to them. Human vehicles, animal vehicles, plant vehicles, all kinds of vehicles. Among them, the human vehicle is the most valuable because in the human vehicle, we have the chance to restore consciousness to its original pure state beyond the cycles of creation and destruction that eternally go on this material level of reality. And that's actually the most important purpose of human life.
I have a question, a follow-up there. My understanding is this is true not just on Earth, but throughout the cosmos. This human vehicle is populated throughout the cosmos. Does the cosmos, do then other planets, I assume, star systems, also abide by the same days of Brahma and the same rules of creation, destruction?
According to the Puranas, the Vedic cosmological texts, there are 400,000 human-like species scattered throughout the entire cosmos. But it's a multi-level cosmos with different levels, with different kinds of energies. The level that we're on now is a very gross level in terms of its energy density.
Right.
There are more subtle realms of the cosmos. They're still material, but they're made of more subtle mental, intellectual, and egotistical energies. And on that level, the beings have vehicles made of more subtle elements than we do. And they have a longer span of life than we do. But essentially, that same human type of vehicle is there, but in a more subtle form. And even that form is a reflection of a higher spiritual reality. The pure conscious self in its spiritual essence has form and senses. And whatever we experience on this level of reality is a reflection of something that is ultimately real. The Vedic sages sometimes give the example of a tree reflected in water. If you see the reflection of the tree in the water, it's not the ultimate reality. If you try to take the fruit from the tree reflected in the water, you don't get it. But it points to the existence of a real tree. So our human form on this level of reality, it's limited in so many ways in terms of being subjected to birth, death, old age, disease, different kinds of trauma, psychological trauma, physical trauma. But it points to the existence of something that really exists on the higher level. And the reason why we're so dissatisfied with our condition here is that deep inside we have some memory of being beyond all of that. And that's what we're meant to recover in our journey through existence on this level of reality.
The Vedas and how they start expressing themselves in some of the lore that certainly we would do on shows like this, looking at what is known as the Lemurian culture and the Atlantean culture. How do the Vedas view these epochs of history? Are they given different names, different locations? Is it considered something entirely different? Let's just talk about those evolutions within human history.
Well, according to the Vedas, there are cycles within cycles within cycles. And we've mentioned some of the larger cycles, the kalpas, the day of Brahma, the manvantars, which last about 300 million years. And then each manvantar is made of a cycle of 71 yugas. 71 cycles of 4 yugas. So the first yuga is called Satya Yuga. It's an age of truth, harmony, and people according to the Puranas, during the Satya Yuga, they lived for 100,000 years. There are no classes, and everyone is involved in yoga and meditation and contemplation. They live very simply and naturally. And that yuga is followed by the Treta Yuga. And in the Treta Yuga, things become degraded by about 25%. And people in the Treta Yuga, according to the ancient texts, live for 10,000 years. And they divide themselves into classes. Some are intellectuals, some are rulers, some are farmers or business people, and then others are artisans and laborers. And they begin to live in towns and villages and cities. And there begins to be some division in society, but it's still, even though these divisions are there, people are still trying to act in harmony with each other.
What is tell me the name of it, that particular
the
cycle?
Yuga.
Okay.
And that's followed by the Dwapara Yuga.
Mm-hmm.
And it's said that in that age, people live for 1,000 years,
Mm-hmm.
and there are conflicts, major conflicts
Mm-hmm.
that start. But they are conflicts that go on according to some kind of civilized rules and regulations. Now we find ourselves in the fourth age called the Kali Yuga, where people live a maximum of 100 years, and practically all spiritual principles are gone. It's a time of increasing environmental and social disturbance.
Mm-hmm.
But, it sounds pretty bleak, but just because it's raining doesn't mean you have to get wet.
Right.
You can shelter yourself, you can shelter others, you can turn even the Kali Yuga, at least for you and whoever is trying to do it, into another golden age. That ability is there. It all depends upon the choices that we make as beings of pure consciousness.
Where does it go after that, after the Kali Yuga?
To another Satya Yuga, another golden age.
Okay, so we're back and then we're going through this again. Okay.
Again and again and
So
again.
where in that would you place what we commonly think to be Lemuria or Atlantis and those
I
cultures?
would say those kinds of cultures refer back to at least the Dwapara Yuga.
Mm-hmm.
One of the features of the Dwapara Yuga is that people were in touch with higher beings
Yes.
at higher levels of the cosmos. In different cultures, they had different names for them: gods, goddesses, devas, jinn, whatever.
Right.
Astral beings. That seems to be a feature of cultures that existed before the beginning of Kali Yuga, which was about 5,000 years ago. They had highly developed technologies, perhaps based on a more subtle science than we have today. I think a lot of our science today is our attempt to duplicate the achievements of previous cultures
Yes.
in denser energies.
There are choices that we're making within this, and we're watching ourselves learning very heavily through contrast and destruction. And many people do appear to be starting to ask different questions now, in the desire, internal desire to move back up into the realms of higher consciousness within us again. But as you say, these destructions do happen periodically. Wipes the slate clean. I'm not saying that's what we're headed for, but I mean, it does happen. Let's get into that process of once we've gone too far out of balance, once a massive destruction, be it natural or otherwise, does occur, there's a process for repopulating the planet and beings that help oversee that. Can you talk about that?
Yes, there are these periodic devastations that take place at the end of each Manvantar in particular. And we're now in the middle of a Manvantar period.
So we're not really slated for that to happen right now.
Not right now, in about 180 million years.
Right.
You know, in December of 2012, I was a speaker on a cruise ship that went to some of the Mayan sites, like Chichen Itza. And I was speaking about the Vedic time cycles. Many people were concerned at that time because one of the time cycles mentioned in the Mayan calendar was about to come to an end. And some people thought that that might involve some kind of cosmic catastrophe or devastation. And I told them that that is coming, but not in December 2012. It's about 180 million years from now.
That was very comforting,
So
I'm sure.
You can register for your next year's classes at school. You can continue to make plans for your life.
And you were right.
But it will happen. It has happened. And the Earth does get repopulated. To me, it's helpful to think of this in terms of cloud computing. You know, people keep their files and their songs and their pictures on the cloud, in the cloud. So if their device happens to get destroyed, well, you can always download it again from the cloud. So our cosmos is arranged sort of like that, so that if there is a devastation on this level of reality, there are resources and intelligence and personalities on the higher levels of the cosmos that can act to repopulate the Earth. According to the Vedic cosmological calendar, the Kali Yuga started 5,000 years ago. It will go on for 427,000 years. But those same writings tell us that the period we're in now is like, it's just like when winter is coming on. Sometimes you get a few warm days. So we're in one of those periods now where it's possible for there to be a golden age even in the midst of Kali Yuga. It all depends upon the choices that we each make as individuals.
About 200 to 300 years before the Christian era, a remarkable mystical movement arose. The core ideas of this movement came from Alexandria, Egypt, but it spread to Palestine, where these mystics set up shop, so to speak. In Egypt, these mystics were called the Therapeutae, the healers. They were known for their flowing white robes. They established an embassy outside the walls of Alexandria on the shores of Lake Mareotis near Alexandria. In Palestine, they were called Essenes and Nazarites, or Nazarenes, meaning watchers, because they were watching for a high celestial being they believed was soon to visit Earth. Although they were primarily, but not exclusively Jewish, the Essenes were master weavers of Egyptian, Iranian, Greek, and Tibetan ascension practices. In fact, for 3 centuries, beginning in 300 BC, the forerunners of this mystic tribe had been following the way of the Magi, researching and merging Babylonian, Egyptian, Iranian, Pythagorean, and Buddhist alchemical philosophies and ascension practices that feature humans opening holes in space and ascending into heaven. In my opinion, they would heavily influence the Essenes and early Christianity. From these teachings, they began writing about translating humans into angels, opening gateways to heaven, and the emergence of a new, improved child of light who would win a war over the sons of darkness and inaugurate a new era of light. Calling themselves the perfect ones, or the way of perfection, or perfect light humans, They seek to lead a revolution in human evolution that would result in the appearance of a new type of human and a different human experience in our world. We will use this word perfect as a sort of a golden needle to weave a thread through various ascension traditions. The word perfect means to become more whole, more holy, more complete, and cosmic. The Essenes believed our purpose and goal in life was to return to our original divine state and recover our garments of light. Remembering our light bodies would lead to a transformed world, they believed. Early sources say the Essenes lived on Mount Carmel in northern Israel, but they also operated a hermetically sealed compound at Qumran and elsewhere. Calling themselves the children of light, the Essenes literally saw themselves in a cosmic war against the children of darkness, who they believed were incarnated as the Roman Empire. They claimed they were making the way for the arrival of a high celestial being who would lead a revolution in human evolution, transforming Earth and humanity into a golden planet of righteousness and the human race into its most perfect state of being. Many believed Jesus was this celestial being. Even more incredible is the Essenes' claim that they were living with an advanced race of angels or extraterrestrials. These angels, who took human form, were known as the Watchers. They were teaching the Essenes the art of ascension, or how to transform our earthly flesh into a celestial flesh and ascend to a celestial city they referred to as Zion, or the New Jerusalem. Out to stop all this mystical nonsense are the children of darkness, who the Essenes believe are incarnate in the mighty Roman Empire, the reigning cabal on earth. In my opinion, the accounts of the Essenes' interactions with the Celestials are contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the texts they left behind. These extraordinary texts affirm there was something truly unusual and mystically special about the Essenes. They are quintessentially spiritual, oriented towards the celestial realm and its otherworldly inhabitants. Their goal was an alliance with the upper world. The scrolls describe cosmic battles, beings, portals, hidden agendas, and new superhumans. And cloaked behind it all is the celestial city, the home and mother church of their angelic teachers and the target of their ascension, and how humans can ascend there. The dark side won a major victory in AD 68 when the Romans decimated the Essenes. Their ascension teachings were lost, stashed in caves near Qumran, but they were not forgotten. Mystical luminaries sought their teachings for ages. Believing in reincarnation, it's possible the Essenes knew that their disappearance at the hands of the Romans was a temporary state of affairs. They would return. The Essenes' cache of scrolls, in fact, was rediscovered by chance in 1947. In my view, these texts describe the process by which all the therapeutae, or members of the Essene community, entered or ascended into the angelic life. The Essenes have an aura of profound mystery about them. Writing in the 1st century AD, the Roman writer Pliny mysteriously claimed that they had existed for thousands of ages, hinting that they are part of a forgotten eternal race that he says exists outside of time. This may be the race later referred to as the immovable race of perfect light humans, or simply as the race in the secret book of John, a Gnostic text of secret teachings. Becoming perfect light humans was clearly the goal of the Essenes. Philo, the famous 1st century AD Jewish philosopher living in Alexandria, Egypt, also briefly discussed the Essenes in his works, Every Good Man is Free and Hypothetica. Intriguingly, he traced their origins to the time of Moses, the Hebrew Messiah or Magi, who emerged as a radiant being after a meeting with God in a burning bush to lead his people to freedom, and who supervised the construction or assembly of the Ark of the Covenant. The burning man or angel he encountered was described as luminous, humanoid, and with a rainbow aura, one of many such beings we will encounter in our journey. Says Philo, multitudes of his disciples has the lawgiver trained for the life and fellowship. These people are called Essenes, a name awarded them doubtless in recognition of their holiness. And we have to remember, holiness means to be luminous, radiant, and angelic. Others trace the Essenes' origins to Enoch, the incredible pre-flood sage, the first human translated to heaven. During his ascension, the archangel Michael anointed Enoch's body with an oil that dissolved his body into rainbow-colored light that matched that of the angels. Take note of the rainbow-angel connection. It will recur repeatedly and is a key to understanding the Essenes in their quest to become perfect light humans. These statements make it clear that the Essenes were ancient, they knew mystical secrets, and these secrets had to do with human transformation into celestial beings and ascension. The purpose of the Qumran community is precisely described in the call of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 3, to prepare the way for the Messiah in the desert wilderness, to prepare a people to meet the Lord. Simply, the Essenes believed a high celestial being was on its way to earth, and they had a plan to manifest this event. During this visitation, says the community rule, the high heavenly being would reveal the mysteries of eternal being, concealed from humankind. At that time, the righteous will be rewarded with healing, great peace, and a long life and fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing and eternal joy and life without end, a crown of glory and a garment of majesty and unending light, says the community rule. The goal of the Essene initiates was to attain this crown and garment. And actually, they said it's the goal of all humans in all ages. The community rule affirms the Essenes were a most holy community who walk in perfection. Their writings contain their teachings about the perfection of this garment of majesty and unending light, actually an angelic light body composed of celestial flesh, as opposed to earthly or human flesh. This is the state of being of the perfect light humans mentioned earlier. From this investigation, the Essenes emerge as these sort of superheroes for ascension. They know that these incredible teachings that they have received from the angels about the light body, about our true nature, about our true history, will serve them, but ultimately they have a vision. They have a vision for a new humanity, a humanity that will live on a planet whose base frequency or vibration is love, light, and righteousness. And they know that while they may not have fulfilled it in their lifetime, that in some future time, perhaps even today, humanity will be able to remember its true nature and ascend to the heavens with the angels.